Once upon a time, many years ago, the Sultan of Dubai decided to take a voyage across the Persian Gulf. Now, the Gulf is a big body of water, almost like an inland sea stretching as far as one could see, shimmering beneath the golden sun. The sky above was a calming blue, not a cloud in sight. The sea was like a giant lying peacefully under the sun's warm gaze, barely a ripple disturbing its skin. The Sultan, accompanied by his trusted courtiers, set sail in a magnificent ship, eager to explore the hidden coves and ancient ruins scattered across the Gulf's embrace. Among them was a young nobleman named Zion, whose veins ran with royal blood, but whose spirit had yet to be tested by the sea, a man untouched by the ocean's vastness and its calming rhythm. As the ship sliced through the waves, excitement crackled among the courtiers. Their laughter echoed across the deck, mingling with the cries of gulls and the gentle sway of the rigging. Zion, however, stood apart, his gaze fixed on the receding shoreline. A shadow had fallen over his face, chasing away the smile that should have mirrored his companion's joy. Confidence ebbed from his stance, replaced by a gnawing uncertainty. While others reveled in the journey's promise, Zion's heart hammered against his ribs, a trapped bird desperate for a window to escape the gilded cage of his chest. He couldn't explain the tremors that shook his limbs, the panic that seemed to coil in his gut. All he knew was that as the land slipped away behind them, a chilling premonition gripped him, whispering of danger just beneath the tranquil surface of the sea. And with each passing moment, as the waves began to rise and fall around them, Zion's dread intensified. Hours passed, turning into days, and still they sailed across the endless expanse of the sea, the sun climbing higher and higher in the sky. But Zion didn't see the sun or the sea. He saw only his own terror reflected in the dancing waves. His face drained of color, his eyes wide and haunted. Then, suddenly, as if awakened from a nightmare, he let out a sharp cry, his voice cracking with fear. He stumbled, his hand shooting out to steady himself on the ship's wooden deck. "We're doomed," he gasped, his gaze wild, his fingers digging into the rough wood. "We're all going to die." His words ripped through the joyful atmosphere, piercing the laughter and curiosity that had filled the air. Every head turned to Zion, their smiles fading into confusion and concern. "What's wrong, my lord?" the Sultan asked, his brow furrowed with worry. "Speak plainly so we can help." But Zion couldn't explain the nameless dread that clawed at his throat, choking off any rational words. He could only scream again, "We're going to die," as if the very sea conspired against them, rising up to swallow them whole. His cries echoed across the deck, mingling with the wind's mournful song. In his terror, he thrashed about, flailing his arms and legs in a desperate dance of panic. But the more he struggled, the tighter his grip on fear became, the more his terror threatened to consume him. Days turned into nights, and Zion's torment didn't abate. He refused food and rest, haunted by the specter of doom that loomed over him. His normally radiant face grew haggard and drawn, his eyes hollow pools reflecting the endless expanse of his despair. The merry atmosphere of the voyage soured, replaced by a heavy silence broken only by the creaking of the ship and the relentless crashing of the waves. The Sultan's hope, which had set sail so brightly, now struggled against the winds of worry. He watched Zion's anguish with growing concern, torn between his friend's terror and the tranquility of the sea. Should they turn back, abandon their journey before it claimed a soul? The thought took root in his mind, threatening to eclipse the purpose of their voyage. Yet even in the darkest depths of Zion's despair, a flicker of calm remained. An elderly scholar named Idris, renowned for his wisdom and serenity, stood quietly observing the unfolding drama. His eyes, deep and knowing, seemed to peer into the heart of Zion's torment. Finally, unable to bear Zion's suffering any longer, he approached the Sultan, his steps slow and measured, his gaze unwavering. "Your Majesty," he began, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder, "grant me leave to act as I must, without question." The Sultan, desperate for any glimmer of hope, inclined his head. What do you propose, Idris? Do as you think fit, and if you succeed, your reward shall be boundless." Idris turned to the crew, his voice echoing with quiet authority. "Fetch the nearest bucket and fill it with seawater." When the bucket was brought before him, he looked back at the Sultan, his eyes filled with a solemn light. "Your Majesty, I ask for permission to perform an act that may seem strange, but trust in my intent." The Sultan, though bewildered, nodded his agreement. The men moved with swift efficiency, their faces taut with tension. They carried Zion to the edge of the ship, and with a mixture of force and gentleness, laid him down on the deck beside the waiting bucket. "My lord, Zion," Idris began, his voice soft yet firm, "this task may appear daunting, but I assure you it's necessary to restore your peace." Before Zion could respond, Idris signaled to the men. They lifted Zion's head and gently lowered it towards the bucket of seawater. Hesitantly at first, then with growing urgency, they plunged his face into the water. At first, Zion struggled violently, thrashing and screaming as the water filled his mouth and nose. But slowly, as if drained by his terror, his movements grew weaker. His gasps subsided into shuddering breaths, his screams into choked sobs. When they lifted his head from the bucket, his face was pale, his eyes vacant, his chest heaving with each shallow breath. The men moved away, leaving Zion alone on the deck, adrift in a sea of his own turmoil. Time seemed to stand still. The sea stretched endlessly before them, mirroring the vastness of Zion's fear. Then, as if awakened from a deep slumber, Zion shuddered violently. His eyes snapped open, wide and disoriented, searching for a familiar landmark in the unfamiliar landscape of his terror. He sat up abruptly, his gaze darting around, his hands trembling. Slowly, as if emerging from a fog, he began to speak. His voice was weak but steady. "Where am I? What has happened?" The Sultan rushed to his side, his face etched with concern. "Welcome back, my friend," he said softly, helping Zion to his feet. "You were lost in the depths of your fear, but now you are here, back among the living." Zion looked around at the faces gathered before him, etched with a mixture of relief and bewilderment. He felt a surge of shame, hot and prickly, creeping up his throat, choking the words. He wanted to ask why they had brought him back, why save him from the depths, but the answer lay buried beneath the wreckage of his terror, a secret he couldn't quite grasp, a truth he wasn't ready to face. When Zion turned to Idris, gratitude and understanding dawned in his eyes. He knew instinctively that the old scholar had saved him, pulling him back from the brink where fear had threatened to engulf him. But how? How could plunging him into his greatest torment bring him back to stability? As the days passed, the gulf unveiled its secrets to them, its waters becoming a mirror to their souls. And as the ship sailed back to shore, bringing their journey to an end, the Sultan sought out Idris. How could plunging him into his greatest fear bring him back? He asked, puzzled. That was no ordinary bucket of water, Iris replied, his voice resonating with a quiet strength. It was a vessel of my own experience, a reflection of the darkness I once inhabited. He paused, his gaze drifting to the horizon, lost in the labyrinth of memory. For I, too, was once drowning in a sea of fear, consumed by an anxiety that threatened to drag me down into its suffocating depths. My mind raced like a captive bird, beating against the bars of my own making, desperate to escape the prison of my thoughts. I was adrift in a sea of possibilities, each wave crashing over me, threatening to capsize my fragile hope. It was a tempest in a sea of what-ifs and could-haves, a storm that seemed to rage eternally, tossing me about without mercy. He turned to the Sultan, his eyes filled with a sorrowful understanding. I understand Zion's torment, for I have walked that path myself. Only in the solitude of my struggle did I realize the folly of my ways. I had allowed fear to grow monstrous in my mind, fed by avoidance and uncertainty. until it became a leviathan blocking my path to peace. By sharing my own story, my own terror, I hoped to guide him back to the surface, back to the light of understanding. Just as I had been pulled back from the abyss, so too could he. It wasn't about extinguishing his fear, but showing him that it couldn't consume him, that he could swim beyond its reach.